Back over to Sam, who's going to take you through today's session. I will be here monitoring the chat, but I'm going to turn my camera off. So take it away, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Wendy. And yes, thank you for joining us for today's session on measuring and managing sustainability as a small business. My name is Sam Walker. I am a consultant at Action Sustainability with a background primarily in performance measurement and then also in sustainability strategy as well. So I look at really broad sustainability strategies, but also more specifically at community engagement strategies, community impact strategies, and then also pieces around EcoVadis and a little bit with ISO 14001 and 9001 too. So thank you for joining. Wendy went through a lot of the different housekeeping that we have, but just to kind of go over a couple of these other bits here. We will have a Menti. Menti is an online platform that we use just to kind of ask questions, get the audience engaged. It's really useful for us to understand who we've got in the room. So if you do have your phone to hand, just keep it ready so we can get you to answer some of those questions. And if you don't, we also can share a code where you can access it on a web browser as well. We'll share the slides after today's session. We will have that feedback. As Wendy said, really important for us to know what you think about the session if you think there's anything missing. So please do complete that. And then, yeah, any questions that you have at any point throughout, do pop them into the Q&A or into the chat function, and I'll get back to them hopefully at the end. And if we run out of time, I can always get back to you via email as well. So what are we going to be looking at today? We're going to start by just doing a simple introduction to sustainability, because before we even touch on that measurement piece and that performance management piece as well, we need to understand, okay, what are we talking about when we're talking about sustainability? And really, what are we talking about when we look at measurement and management? Then we're going into the detail looking at how that measurement applies to sustainability. Some of those really hot topics that we tend to see. So carbon emissions is in there. We see a lot with waste. Community engagement again is in there. And then that next step is, okay, well, we're measuring, but how do we make sure that that data that we're collecting is feeding back into ideally our overall approach or our overall sustainability strategy? Really, really key that we make sure we've got that piece established as well, because we want to be setting up a process where you have continuous improvement built in. The other thing just to note as well is that when we're talking about sustainability management, it's also about those processes that we're using to collect and measure sustainability and how we can actually look at those and make them more efficient over time. We might start, if we are starting with measurement from scratch, at just kind of looking at a couple of hot topics. So it could be carbon and waste, but eventually we want to improve those processes and ideally standardize them so we can then start looking at measuring other topics as well. But before I get into the content, it would be really interesting for me just to know where people are when we're talking about sustainability and that measurement and management piece as well. So if people could please head over to menti.com. So if you do have your phone, you should be able to just point the camera up at the QR code here on the screen. If not, you can go to menti.com on your web browser, and if you pop in the code 32104837, you should be prompt to put in that code there. And I've just got a couple of questions which I'll ask. Once you are there, if you could just give me a thumbs up so I can see that people are here. And I'm just going to go start the presentation. Perfect. Thank you. You can see some thumbs coming up. We will go, let's go to our first question here. And good, I can see we've got 9 on the Menti. If you have any issues, just let us know in the chat and we'll hopefully get you over there as well. Perfect. And Wendy's popped in the Menti code into the chat if you are having any difficulties. So yeah, first question that we've got here for you is, what is your current knowledge level of sustainability? So we've got 5 different levels. We've got limited there at the beginning, basic, then we've got intermediate, advanced, and then expert. So quite a varied group of people, which is good to see. So hopefully for those of you who are maybe more established in your approach with sustainability, we'll be talking a little bit more about how you can kind of look at implementing some of this stuff to your supply chain, or at least helping and supporting your supply chain begin measuring sustainability, or at least working with sustainability. So thank you for that question. I'll move on to the next one there, which is what's your primary motivation for working on sustainability right now? I'll touch on drivers, a really, really important piece which goes into our strategies. We need to know why we want to be looking at sustainability and measuring sustainability specifically as well. So a couple of different options here. We've got reducing costs, we've got customer client demand, investor owner expectations, regulatory pressure, and then it's just not a priority yet if you're sitting in that camp. So we've had 6 out of 11 responses, so I'll just leave it a moment for you to respond. But it seems like customer client demands are the most popular. I'd say that aligns with a lot of the other sessions that I've done. Regulatory pressure is huge in the UK, but understand that in the US, you're governed by so many different regulations depending on the state that you're in. So it can really, really differ based on that. And investor owner expectations now as well. So it's coming from, internally with owners, but also externally if you want to be able to borrow money. Oh, and I can see some comments coming in as well. So reduce cost, customer demand. Yeah, and in California, absolutely, there's a lot of regulation around sustainability. So thank you for completing that question. Next one there is how familiar are you with measuring and reporting on sustainability? So that was more kind of just talking about that sustainability piece in general, now going into that lens of measuring and reporting. So we've got 4 levels here. So we're completely new to it. Next level there is we've started collecting some data, but want to strengthen our overall approach. Then we've got the next level, which is we're confident with what data we're collecting, but want guidance on how to report this and what to do next. And that final stage there, which is confident with what we're collecting and how we're reporting on this. So again, quite evenly split. Well, more kind of focused in the middle. So I think people are probably working around the data that they're collecting. With this webinar, the good thing about it is that at whatever point in the process you're in with collecting and measuring your sustainability impact, it's good to kind of go back and just reassess and go through the process from the beginning to just make sure that you have that constant alignment, especially with those drivers, that you understand, why it is that you're doing what you're doing. And with the process piece, as well, as I was saying, if you can find opportunities to try and make collecting that data, analyzing that data, reporting then that data more efficient, then it's going to help in the long term, A, with your impact, because it will be feeding into those business decisions that you're making, but also just in terms of hopefully making that process more efficient and then giving you more time to actually implement some of these initiatives or expand to look at different topics. So thank you for completing that one. My last question then at the minute is what are you currently measuring when it comes to sustainability? Range of different topics. We've got energy and carbon, waste, material use, which is more looking at that circular economy piece, impact on biodiversity, impact on community, water, supplier diversity, modern slavery, skills and training, or nothing yet. So I'll just give you a moment to complete this question. I think at the minute, this is what I would expect to see. Energy and carbon, of course, is a huge one, and it's not going away. We're seeing reporting requirements get more and more robust and established around this. Waste is also quite highly connected to energy and carbon. We need to measure how much of the waste that we're producing is going to landfill or is being burned to energy. That has an implication on our carbon footprint. So it fits in quite nicely there, as does material use, really. Impact on biodiversity, really, really important, but I would say this aligns with what we tend to see, that it isn't always a priority as much as other topics when it comes to reporting. You've got impact on community. Water, again, becoming really, really key. We're seeing more droughts, more flooding, more natural disasters in general that are really disrupting water supplies. So this is becoming a really key topic that people are measuring as well with sustainability. And then maybe less on that modern slavery and skills and training. We see a lot on with community engagement. Actually, that skills piece fits into that as well, in that it's not just looking at maybe that time or that money that's being donated into communities, but actually what we're doing to upskill those people in communities as well. So it does sometimes fit under that too. So thank you for completing those questions. I will have Menti come back later on in the session. So do keep that up just in a tab or on your phone. But for now, I'm just going to start going through some of the content for today's session, starting off really with just an introduction to sustainability. Now, I won't spend too long on this because it sounds like people already have a good idea of what sustainability means. Hopefully, this is just going to be a bit of a refresher for you. But when we're talking about sustainability, we are now really talking about having quite a holistic approach to it. We're not just focusing on providing a long-term positive impact to the environment. We also want to make sure that we're encompassing these other two pillars as well, which is the social and the economic. We need to make sure that as organizations, we're making some kind of profit. And that is really, really key as well, that we need to be doing that if we also want to be implementing those other two pillars. But of course, they are also important as well. So we've got the environmental in there. So we're looking at natural resources, we're looking at materials and how materials are used, circular economy, are how we interact with the environment in terms of water, everything like that. Air quality, a huge one as well within the built environment when we're talking about plant and equipment that's being used on sites. We then have the social side there as well, which is really looking at that community engagement piece, but it's also just human rights and modern slavery. Modern slavery is huge in that we're seeing more and more legislation coming out around due diligence. So organizations making sure that they are trying to put in different processes within their organization to identify any risks where modern slavery or forced labor might be occurring. And then you have things like well-being as well, physical and mental, it should be stressed. And then, of course, the economic piece as well. So when we talk about sustainability, we want to absolutely be considering each of these pillars. And ideally, when we implement these different sustainability initiatives, we want to be aiming for that bit in the middle, that sweet spot in the middle, where whatever that initiative is that we're implementing is having a positive impact on the environment, on the social element as well, and economically too. Examples of that might be, if you are working in a community, can you hire people who are from a slightly disadvantaged background or a background where they traditionally face barriers getting into work? And in that way, you're not just providing a job and helping the community grow, but you're actually also helping people who would typically not be able to get that work. So we are again looking at trying to kind of get that sweet spot in the middle. And if you provided a job there that was around, environmental or sustainability, or as that was kind of embedded in the role, then you really would be hitting that piece in the middle. So when we talk about sustainability, absolutely, that's where we want to be looking at. It's got to be around the long term. Sustainability can't be just looking at the short term. And we also want to make sure that, yeah, we can measure eventually what we want to look at, which I'll come to shortly. There are a huge amount of topics when we talk about sustainability. Again, it seems like people have a good grasp on kind of how you can categorize them, what you can look at. This slide is purely just to kind of give you a bit of an idea of how you can look at those different topics, along with those drivers at one side of this illustration and then the enablers at the other. Now, if you are new to measuring sustainability or just sustainability in general, I'd probably recommend that you just have a look at this diagram and you kind of figure out, okay, out of these topics, which are the ones that are most relevant to us? Now, that can really depend. When I say relevant, it can depend on your industry. It can depend on the size of your organization. It can depend on your personal motivations or the motivations of your clients or who you've got within your organization in senior leadership. It could be your investors, but you need to come together and kind of talk about, okay, what topics do we want to prioritize and why do we want to prioritize them? Another really key piece to consider as well, which is often overlooked, is that how, the enablers, because as an organization, you might have particular strengths that actually allow you to deliver on having a more positive impact within a specific sustainability topic more than another. Technology is huge here, so you might have really good advanced kind of processes set up within your organization already that let you help collect carbon data. And then maybe that means that you're in a better position to be able to be looking at that from the beginning rather than, trying to do everything at once. So really key to just kind of sit down, have a look at this diagram and figure out, yeah, what it is that you want to have a look at, why you want to do it, and then what you might have within your organization that's going to help that. And that can be a SWOT analysis, so strength, weakness, opportunity, or threat analysis, but some kind of mechanism or process to just kind of have a look at what it is that's going to be relevant. Another thing just to add here is on the sustainability development goals, which is a internationally known set of goals around some of these sustainability topics that, universally companies, governments are working towards to leave a long-lasting positive impact. Now, these align quite nicely to some of those topics that I showed in that previous slide. But often when organizations come to us and they say, we don't really know where we want to start with measuring sustainability and just implementing initiatives in general, where can we go? What do we look at? I show them that illustration from that previous slide, and I recommend that they go to the Sustainable Development Goals website as well, because when you go through these, you can start reading, you can see, okay, yep, this speaks a little bit more to us. We're going to prioritize looking at this one. We don't really work around clean water and sanitation, so we're going to prioritize gender equality because actually we work a lot in communities more, and we feel like we can go into schools and do something around upskilling women in the construction built environment to try and get more women in the industry. There's different things that can be done. It's about, again, that piece really around prioritizing what you want to look at. And that is really, really key because understand that as organizations, we have a limited amount of resources that we can invest into things. So we need to kind of look at prioritization. Of course, why should we be doing any of this? Because when I send people away and they say, okay, we can do that, but how much time is it going to take? We don't have a lot of time to be able to invest into this. And actually, there's a lot of people within our organization who don't think sustainability is a very important topic to begin with, and we shouldn't be spending this time measuring it. There are multiple reasons now. We're seeing, multiple drivers again for why we should be working as organizations to deliver sustainability and measure our sustainability performance. A couple of them here, but really, really key to point out. I think I've already mentioned just about regulation and legislation. We're seeing more of a drive around sustainability, not always, it doesn't have to be in that particular state that you're operating in. It can be across, like in California, where they're setting a very high standard with regulation. It could be across the sea in Europe, in the UK, where those standards are slightly higher. So if you're an organization operating in multiple places, multiple countries, it's going to have that knock-on impact, and you're going to want to make sure that you do adhere to whatever regulation exists. There's the piece around brand reputation as well. Customers, clients are asking for it. They want to be seeing that some kind of effort is being made with implementing sustainability. So we're seeing more of this drive really for organizations who want to implement something and want to start measuring as well. So that's that piece on sustainability. So let's now talk about, okay, we are at a point where we know what topics we want to look at. We kind of have an idea of those drivers. How do we actually start measuring it? And before we touch on going into what that process looks like, really important just to kind of go over some of that terminology. First piece here is a sustainability strategy. This is a vital part of measuring our sustainability performance. And really, I would recommend, if you haven't got that strategy put together, you shouldn't be looking right away at that measurement piece because the strategy provides that overall direction. It gives you guidance on, what you're measuring, why you're measuring it, what data you need to collect, why you're collecting it, how you're collecting it, who's responsible. Ideally, your strategy is going to have all that information in it. So without it, it can be very hard to get people invested into collecting that data from different suppliers. Or it can be very hard to actually get people invested in, analyzing the data or responding to the data that comes in. So really key that you have that overall strategy that is directing your approach to measurement. The second piece is performance measurement itself, which is the process of collecting and reporting data on your sustainability performance. And that next piece there is on sustainability performance management, which is the process really of using what you're collecting through that measurement process to improve your outcomes and make decisions within your organization. It's about that continuous improvement piece, which is once you have that data, just making sure that it does feed into your strategy. And really, it should be quite an iterative process. So when you collect the data, you want that to feed into your strategy. You want that to then feed into decisions that you make as an organization. And then those decisions should feed into your strategy. Do they still align? Is there a misalignment there? If there's that misalignment, then we need to update our strategy, which means that maybe we then need to look at the data that we're collecting again, and then it goes on and on. So really key to keep that in mind as well. And just understand that differentiation between the two because again a lot of the time when we see organizations working around sustainability reporting, we see a lot done around that measurement piece but not so much being done around that management piece. Organizations will report it and that's where it stops and they think, okay, that's enough, and then their strategy or their report might sit on their website for another year. But I absolutely needs to feed into those business decisions and become really embedded and integrated. So that process that we look at when we're talking about performance measurement and performance management, first of all, it's that drivers and that strategy piece that I've mentioned already, but really formalizing that. Then we need to come up with a measurement framework. And there's frameworks that already exist, which are, for example, like the Sustainable Development Goals that can be used. You then have that reporting and analysis piece. And really, those three steps fall into that performance measurement. And then that last step there on informed actions, which is that performance management piece. So just before I kind of go into that in more detail, again, I'll just get everyone to hop over to Menti. I've just got a couple of questions really to understand maybe some of the drivers around why you're looking at sustainability measurement. So if people could please go back to menti.com. It is the same code and the same QR code. So I think we still got, 11 people here, which is great. So if you just want to head back over, and my next question there is, do you operate in states with different sustainability or climate requirements? Again, as I was saying, as a driver, yeah, okay, so it's quite interesting already coming through. Yeah, I can't imagine how complicated it must be in that sense with if you're operating in California, and New York, the difference in legislation and regulation that might apply compared to other states. Mostly here saying, yeah, there are major differences, but that's really interesting to know for like the next time I do the session, just to kind of understand some of those nuances. So thank you for that. I will go to the next question there, which is, are your work colleagues or your staff interested and driven by sustainability? Quite a broad question because I imagine that it will probably be quite split, but let's see what people think. And you can think of this in terms of, of those initiatives that you're implementing, if you are already doing that. Are people asking questions about it? Are they engaged in it? Do they want to get involved in it? If you've got volunteering, for example, do people do that? or not. So actually, kind of, mostly yes, which is good to see because, again, I would say that aligns quite nicely. We see it as, a real driver. If people see sustainability in an organization and these initiatives being implemented, they want to get involved. They want to work for that organization. They're more invested in the work that they're doing. But I understand also the context at the minute, it's so turbulent, cost of living, all of that. Understand that it's not going to be a priority for everyone. But hopefully, even though all these challenges are existing, people still see it as a positive kind of thing. I know there's a lot of conversation around, sustainability is a cost. It's just, a cost to the company. But actually, from a lot of research that I've seen, it can be a cost, but actually, it's a really good way of reducing of becoming more efficient, which is reducing costs. And if it's done correctly and you've got all these mechanisms in place, like a strategy at the beginning, and you follow through with it and you've got that investment, you've got that drive, it can actually have a really positive impact on your organization. So thank you. I think I've got one more question that's coming up later on in the webinar. So do just keep that open again. But interesting to know, yeah, some of those drivers already. So around the policy and legislation in different states, and then also just personal investment from people within your organizations. So absolutely core that in that first step of the process, we have drivers sorted. So it is about going through that process of asking what topics matter, why they matter, and how we might as an organization facilitate implementing that. Another really key question to consider is, what matters to different stakeholders. And it might be that, to a local community, that piece around air quality and the impact on the natural environment is going to be a really key topic that they're interested in. Whereas for example, if you have like a sustainability team or you have a legal team within your organization, it might be actually more around that carbon piece because there's certain carbon reporting standards that you need to adhere to. So it can really differ, and it's definitely a piece that needs to be considered as well. That often manifests itself in what's called a risk and opportunity analysis, which then goes on to form a materiality analysis. So, a materiality analysis is asking those questions around what sustainability topics are the most relevant. And relevant here is based on how important are they to stakeholders, and that can be internal or external stakeholders, but also impact as well. What's the impact on the organization and or of us as an organization on those impacts? But what we're seeing more and more is double materiality, which is that key. So it's not just what's our impact on that topic, what's that topic's impact on us. So what's our carbon footprint, but what are the possible implications of, more and more carbon emissions going into the atmosphere and rising sea levels, more natural disasters? What impact could that have on us as an organization as well? And that usually reflects a quite a mature approach to sustainability if you're doing that double materiality. If we look at what organizations are looking at, and I think this aligns quite nicely with what people answered in the Menti, it is absolutely that piece around carbon emissions from own operations. And I'll come to this in a moment on scope one, scope two, and scope three. But here it is carbon emissions from own operations. You've got things then like emissions, effluents, and waste, which is, again, it was one of the highest rated categories. Carbon emissions from your products and services, that's scope three. Occupational health and safety, that's the social element there. But you can see that really this aligns quite nicely with the responses that we got. Land use and biodiversity, again, that wasn't a really hot priority, but it is being measured, but perhaps not as much of a priority as the others. You can see that reflected here. Same there with land use and biodiversity and supply chain. But just, yeah, quite interestingly, really over the last 5 years at least, like we haven't seen a huge shift in the topics being measured or the difference. It is just carbon emissions. And again, we do anticipate that becoming more and more prevalent. But I think if anything, the other topics under here are also kind of growing in prevalence as well. And also, yeah, just a really key point there. It's not all about the climate. Understand that there are more regulations and reporting requirements around it, but look at what you're doing in communities. And often, smaller organizations are in a really strong position and they're already delivering some kind of benefit to the community, whether that's, an hour of volunteering here and there or just employing locally that is having some kind of positive impact. And if you're doing that, then what can you do to measure it? Because hopefully it's not too far away. It doesn't require a lot of time to set up those processes to measure that piece as well. Just talking about carbon emissions here, because it is an absolute, yeah, it's the key topic really where we see people reporting and measuring. You have it divided between scopes 1, 2, and 3. I'd say the majority of organizations nowadays are measuring at least their scope 1, scope 2 emissions. If you are not, and you are not too sure what the kind of carbon emissions of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 are, would just recommend that you take a look at some of our resources on the supply chain sustainability score because we have some really great um, videos, e-learnings that kind of explore and unpick carbon emissions and what the different scopes mean. But just to summarize for now, scope 1 are your direct emissions. So that's generally your fuel use that you use in any vehicles. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions, but that tends to be just the electricity that you consume if you have an office building, if you have any electric cars. And then scope 3 there as well, which is indirect. If you are new to sustainability and looking at sustainability measurement, my recommendation to you would be start with carbon emissions, start with looking at your direct emissions and then your scope 2 indirect emissions. And then once you've done that, expand to looking at your scope 3 emissions. And those categories in scope 3, there's a lot of them, as you can see here. I'd really recommend some of the easier ones to look at are business travel and purchase goods and services should be added as well here as well. Purchase goods and services tends to be the category where we see the largest amount of carbon emissions, but it depends again on the industry that you're working in and also the size of your organization. If you're using a lot of cement or you're a manufacturer, you're producing materials, then it's going to be based more in, processing and the extraction of those raw materials as well. All of this needs to be captured in your sustainability strategy. So still really talking about before we even get to that measurement piece and that data collection piece, let's make sure that that's all captured in our strategy. I've mentioned these points already with what should go in there, but probably good if you've got a strategy already to just review these points, make sure that that's captured in it. And then also recommend that you take a look at these two sustainability strategies here, one by Walmart and one by Apple, that are quite a good best practice, I would say, on how you work around sustainability and pulling that strategy together. What I do just want to point out here is that you'll see the terminology is slightly different and they're both framed as first one by Walmart, an ESG report, and the second one there is an environmental progress report. Differentiation between strategy and report. A strategy is that long-term view that you want to of what you want to achieve. It should have that mission and vision statement in there. A report is really going to be an update each year that you produce that tells you how you're doing against your strategy and those goals that you set. But what we see organizations tend to do is that they will combine them. So, for example, the first couple of pages are going to be this is what we set out to do. And then the next couple of pages are this is where we are at the minute. And then this is what we have to do to get where we want to. Other thing to just point out is that terminology around ESG, because there can be some mix up between the two. I think they are used interchangeably sometimes as terms. How I see it is that sustainability is a lot broader. ESG is maybe a more specific framework that is used. It's often to do with measuring it from a more financial kind of perspective, which sustainability more broadly doesn't necessarily have. That ESG piece, of course, the environmental, social, governance piece fits in there. So it does reflect some of those three pillars. But actually, ESG, a lot of the time, it is a framework that's provided. So it will give you an idea of the goals that you need to have a look at and those specific KPIs or indicators and metrics that need to be measured. So you've got your strategy. Let's do some data collection. But to be able to do that, we need to have a framework. At the most basic level, really, when we're talking about a framework, we need to make sure that it has these key components to it. And this framework is just really what's driving us to measure what we're measuring, and it outlines what we need to know what we to get the data, sorry, to be able to collect it. So it's usually made up of these four components, which are the goal, the target, the indicator, metric. You might also see objectives in here as a term that can be used. Again, we see that being used interchangeably with metrics and indicators, targets as well. But how we kind of differentiate it is the goal is the overarching statement really that you have that you want to achieve. The target is much more specific. I've got a slide in here on smart target, so that's where that comes in. We want it as specific as possible. We want ideally some kind of numerical value in there, a percentage or tons of CO2. We want to see a date ideally as well, which isn't included here, but it will be, we want to reduce our scope one carbon emissions by 40% by 2030 on a 2019 baseline year. So you just want to make it as specific as possible, get those dates in there. Doesn't always have to be, because a lot of the time when we're talking about social goals and social targets, it can be harder to quantify those. It's maybe more qualitative in nature. That is fine. And yeah, as I say, depending on the topic, it sometimes lends itself more to having that qualitative nature. But ideally, over time, look for ways that you can increase the amount of quantification that you're including in all of your targets. If you can embed that in, it is going to be easier to measure progress generally. You have the indicator then, which is really that mark of progress. So you know how you're performing against your goal and your target. And then metric is that data input point. If you've got your strategy and you're already measuring data, hopefully you've got these four components. And if you are, and you think you do have that, I would just be going through this thinking, yep, we've got this, yep, we've got that. We got that, we got that. No, actually, we're missing an indicator for that. Why are we missing an indicator? We should have something a bit more specific. Or really, we should have a target. Our target could be more specific. I'd just be going through that process as I'm going through this. Other thing to note actually as well on this is that it can be quite difficult to come up with a goal if you're approaching sustainability for the first time. To know what realistic looks like within your organization can be very difficult. It's really fine if for a year or a couple of months you need to just set a broad goal, set your indicator so you kind of have an idea of how you're going to measure progress and start collecting that data, so that metric piece, and then come back to it 6 months later when you have that data and you say, okay, well, on this project, we were able to have 10 apprenticeships. On this project, we had five. Okay, so an average from all of these different projects, maybe that's where we can be aiming for. So this is going to be a good goal. Another piece to consider there is benchmarking. So going out into the market, looking at what your clients are doing around sustainability, looking at what your competitors are doing. That's a really, really key piece as well, just to make sure that you do align with your goals and targets. And again, that they're not too unrealistic. You can come up with a framework yourself. I would recommend, if you are doing this, to align it to the sustainability development goals, which are a framework, but they're not as established as some of the other frameworks we see in, for example, the global reporting initiative, so the GRI, or there's ESG as a framework that I mentioned. They provide a much more specific idea of what topics you need to look at and then how you measure each of them. This is giving you a little bit more flexibility. If you're a smaller organization, or you want to roll this out to your supply chain and you're working with smaller organizations, it's probably a good exercise to just get them to start to think around, okay, what are those topics that are relevant? What are those goals, targets, and you can kind of share your own goals and targets with them so they can align to that, or comment, well, that won't be realistic to us, but do you think that we could set this goal for us and that's a bit more realistic? Or perhaps it's an opportunity for that capability building with them as well. We don't think we can achieve this, but why don't you think you can achieve this? Can we do anything to help? Can we upskill you on that particular topic? Again, around that community impact piece, we find that so many small organizations are already doing things about it. So they might instantly say, oh, we can't deliver X amount of volunteering hours or money donations in the community, and then you find they're doing sponsorships, or there's other ways that they're investing in that community. So um, really, really key, yeah. And it's a good exercise to just get them to start thinking about it, and that data collection piece, because again, we just get organizations who will go into, okay, let's just start collecting data without really having that oversight of how it's feeding into their overall strategy. Of course, again, just to kind of echo that, it is really key, I suppose, when we're coming up with this framework to consider that source, collect, and that reporting piece as well. It is a lot to have to consider, but it does just make the process easier eventually in that reporting piece and how it will feed into all those decisions. If we can make sure that we've got all these steps really established. And what I mean by that is these bullet points on the screen. So, if we're collecting the data, making sure that people are responsible, they know they're responsible for collecting the data, they are responsible for ensuring data quality, because that's a huge piece as well. I can't tell you how many reports that I've had organizations say we've got 100%, rate of reports being completed this month, and then you look at them and there's like 1 0 in the report, or something's been entered in the wrong unit, and you have to go back. Data quality is huge, but making sure, yeah, that it's established, and these are some of those considerations to think about if you're at that beginning step. Have a look at it now, just kind of reflect on how that might impact some of those topics that you pick. If you're that more a mature approach, think about whether you've got these things already established, if there's anything missing, any gaps that might be there. Just to kind of quickly go through some of those targets that we expect to see for different topics here. So for carbon emissions, it is generally around reducing scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. It's often aligned to what's called the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is an organization that a lot of organizations make this commitment to reduce carbon emissions, and it carries that credibility to it, as does having some of those frameworks like ESG. So have a look at the SBTI. They do have a route specifically for smaller organizations, but you might find, if you're a micro organization, or your supplier or supply chain, you've got micro organizations, it might not be worth actually committing, but you can still align to the SBTI, and that's quite a good opportunity to at least make sure that you're consistent with what your clients and your competitors are doing. You've got waste there, so we see a lot around percentage reductions in waste. I will add though, and I think people are probably already working with it based on the responses that I got on maturity with sustainability, but that circular economy piece. So it's not just about reducing waste to landfill, but actually how we can turn what might be considered waste into another material in another process, in another industry, or we can repurpose those resources or that waste and reuse it within other areas of our own company. So waste is a really, really key one. Absolutely focus on, diverting 100% of waste from landfill, or ideally, yeah, not having waste burnt for energy. But circular economy is where we want to end up at. On waste, last thing I'll just say actually on that is that, again, on the supply chain sustainability school, we have some good resources on the waste hierarchy, which are a really good place to start if you're wondering, how do I even look at, prioritizing sending waste to landfill, or how do I do reuse, and where does that fit into, how I should prioritize all these other actions. So I can send that out in the email as well after, just come some of those recommended resources. Water there, a really, really huge one too. Recommend just kind of having a look back if you are new to it. And community, we mustn't forget that social element as well. So you can see here it could be pounds or dollars spent on donations to charities. Time is a really key one. If you can give volunteering days to people within your organization, again, really, really key. Need targets to be smart. So that is that specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound piece. When you're coming up with those targets, just make sure that you have considered that, because if we have quite loose targets, it's harder to measure that progress, and also it's just not as robust and doesn't look as credible to some of our clients. So really key that we do that. Again, if you're working around doing a lot of this sustainability measurement piece already, you're probably familiar with SMART. But if not, I've provided quite a bit of content here so you can use it after the session and refer back to the slide. So collecting the data, final question is just on whether you have any barriers to collecting good sustainability data. And there should be where you can pop in whatever response you want. I'll just give you a moment for that. Because I'd say, well, silo departments, yeah, absolutely. And then it's having those conversations with them and trying to get people invested and understand why you're doing it. From general contractor, yes. From your supply chain. So what advice do I have around that? I think that's where um, during the procurement stage, the initial procurement stage, that's where it's really important to kind of have some kind of clause or just kind of awareness statement around your intention to collect data on sustainability. If you've got if you can put like a small guide together to help them understand, what it is they need to measure and how they measure it. We did a guide on, it was around carbon emissions and, what you need to collect, really kind of down on a very basic level. So, what bills do you need to look at? That kind of thing, but just really trying to make it as straightforward as possible, acknowledging that a lot of these organizations don't have a lot of time. Engagement of those with the data, absolutely. Transparency within organization systems to collect data. Yeah. Easy to understand guidelines. Process. Yeah, and verify. Yeah, verification is a huge piece as well. That can be quite time consuming. Ideally, don't have anyone who's reporting the data into a tool being the one who is also verifying the data, but that is often the case. That does happen. It's happened with many organizations that I've worked with. Um, and ideally put in that step if you can that requires the person who's entering the data to just check it before submitting. That's a really key step as well. So I've worked with like tools that people can report data into as well, where if they've reported for like 3 months, for example, and the value is like 120% higher than the month before, it will automatically flag it, things like that. So there are things that can be done to hopefully then make that verification process easier. But thank you. Um, Good to understand some of those challenges and barriers that you're facing. Ensuring a good response rate, I think that came up around, investment. How do we get people to do that? How do we get our suppliers to report that data on time? Um, it is about, okay, first of all, let's focus on key areas. What can they provide us first? Let's not give them everything at once. Let's start them off with scope one and scope two, and then build off of that. Who in that organization is going to be responsible for providing that data? Can we have one person instead of it kind of going from person to person where we then have to explain the whole process again? Communicating your expectations clearly, ideally, if you can, through that procurement stage, it would be perfect. But if not, can you do it through any kind of interactions that you have? Adequate training on understanding what data it is that you're collecting, how you're collecting it, that piece around the goals, the targets, the indicators, metrics, what they all mean, how it feeds in. Assigning a point of contact for any questions within your own organization, really, really key. And then schedule reminders and follow-ups. Really, there's quite various opinions on how often organizations should report data, and I think it depends on the type of data and the type of organization actually more broadly. One of the pieces is, we should get them to be doing it every month because then they're in the habit of doing it. But then others will say, well, that's too time consuming. Actually, it would be better if they did it once every quarter. There's no right or wrong way, really. I would avoid trying to do it annually if possible. Doing it quarterly is probably a little bit better than annually, just because then there is more of a chance that someone might have come in to have to report the data, but when the handover was done, because it was so far off in the future, they didn't even think about explaining it. Challenges like that. But yeah, ideally, making sure that you have assigned a point of contact for questions and all these other steps as well. Just to also add around how much data you should collect, because again, I think a lot of organizations kind of invalidate their efforts because they think that they haven't been able to collect all of the data that they need. If you're starting out, it's really okay to start with, collecting sample data and then ideally moving towards proxy data and then ideally then getting real data for the whole year. But if you've got suppliers who are just starting to collect it, it might be really hard. Again, it might be time consuming. It might be easier to go to them and say, can you send us your fuel usage for like 6 months of the year at alternate places? And then we can kind of take that and do something with it. And then maybe next year you can build up that process to then say each month of the year. Or perhaps you're starting with, okay, let's measure scope 1, 12 months, but then you add in a new topic or a new metric each time. So just key to keep that in mind. And then just quickly on the performance management piece, and then I will just go to the chat just in case there's any questions. This is really the key piece where we're making sure that once we've got that data, we're putting it back into our strategy and our overall approach to performance measurement. It is the data we collect, it is only really as valuable as it is used. So what we mean by that it needs to feed into our business decisions. What I mean by that is that, if you're seeing that you're um, if you're seeing there's like a skills gap in a particular trade, um, can you do something around that when you're working in local communities? And can you look at ways to kind of upskill people in that trade? How does that feed into your strategy? And then how does that kind of sift through, I suppose, to the community? So there's that. But really, it is just, yeah, making sure that you're making informed decisions rather than kind of just trying to navigate without kind of having a look at what the context is and just making some misinformed decisions. And then just to kind of say around the how we present the data, I'll leave these slides in the presentation for you to look at. But when we want to be reporting, just keep in mind that there are different stakeholders who are going to be involved and they will be looking at it and understanding it differently. So bar charts, tables, graphs, really, really important. Pie charts, really good. But the two that I really want to highlight are infographics because they are really good for storytelling and it's that combination of statistics and imagery. So usually it's slightly more engaging. And then also around dashboards as well, if you can kind of set something up, if you have a tool that allows people to navigate it, it's really important. So I think what I'll do is I will move just to kind of any questions that might have come in, or let me just check the chat just to see if we have got any questions. Are there any questions, Wendy? I'm just thinking rather than go through these last couple of slides, if there's anything that's come in, I can go
I
through it.
think there was a more of a comment from Pamela just in terms of
Sure.
before we get to the strategy, make sure you know where you are and make sure that you're doing
Yeah.
that benchmarking piece, which I absolutely agree with. It's very important to know, what it is that you want to achieve, how much have you achieved already. So I think that's that I think that we've talked a lot. We've I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We only have a few minutes left. So yeah, Sam,
Yeah.
were there many more slides that we wanted to cover or?
No, I'll just go through this one then. It was just if there were any questions, happy to take those over going through the content. But yeah, if there's no questions, I'll just do this slide. And if people have questions, feel free to pop them in and I can get back via email. That's totally fine.
Mhm.
But we'll just talk about that buy-in really, because again, that comes up as a barrier often a lot of the time that people aren't bought into the idea of sustainability, but also collecting the data. So really, really important here that we do try and put in those processes that ensure that we have that buy-in, because if we don't get it, the impact it can have on that data quality piece is huge. So when we talk about that driving, we want to make sure that we have higher quality data. We want to make sure that we've got more timely reporting on that, more accurate decision making around that data, and then on our sustainability outcomes as well. So that's feeding into what we then deliver when we're talking about those initiatives. That then will matter, or what will matter and how it will matter will depend on the stakeholder really that is behind that. So again, this is where it's quite important to consider that stakeholder piece all the way through. Um, so yeah, do consider that, and kind of here I've got a slide that just kind of highlights maybe what those motivations are more typically when we're talking about specific stakeholders, and then using that to inform how to kind of get that buy-in from them and collect that data. Piece here on that communication of building buy-in. Again, really, really key. Not to kind of overwhelm, especially our supply chain suppliers, making sure that they understand. But then, yes, I think that was it. So if people do have any questions, please pop them in. But I think I've seen a couple of people heading off already. So not a problem. Thank you so much for joining. And if you do have any questions for me, just let me know. But we'll send the slides out and also any recommendations on resources. But thank you for coming, and I hope to see you at another one of our webinars. I'll hand it over to you, sorry, Wendy, just to close the session off.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Really
Thanks
appreciate
all.
the presentation. I thought it was really well done. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for your comments and your engagement and your answers in the Menti polls. It's always great to sort of have that, we're not just floating heads on the screen, we're all part of a conversation. So yeah, if you do have any questions, if anything pops into your head at 3 a.m. tonight and go, oh, I didn't ask that question, my contact details are going to be sent out. I'll make sure that Sam gets your question. And we'll make sure that you get an answer to it. And like I said, or sorry, like Sam said, we'll send out some helpful resources as well for you guys to follow up with if you want to continue on with this journey. So we'll wrap it up exactly on time. Look at that. Thank you everyone again for being here, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.